Okay, so on the Canvas page on our files, there's the final practice problems document. So we're going to be working off of that. Basically, no real new content. As I work through some of these practice problems or present additional problems, it may be things we've talked about, but different combinations of them. But in terms of the types of things that we can see combinations of, there will be kind of no new content kind of from here on out. So let's open up this file, final exam practice problems. So you kind of see here, this will somewhat look like the exam where there will be kind of a small number of multiple choice, and then a few short answers, similar to the midterm. This one I put way more short answer questions than would be on the actual exam, just so you have some more practice, but I wanted to give you some short answers as well that we could work through. So any one of these problems that are multiple choice or short answer, they kind of could be flipped, right? The concepts are going to be the same, it's just I could turn some of the short answers into multiple choice, and so I want to work through the multiple choice ones today, kind of giving some insights on how maybe they could be turned into short answer, and then maybe go over a couple of the short answer, and then save tomorrow we'll do kind of the rest of the short answer questions. So probably a pretty quick little stream here today, quick little video, but I think it'll be good to get some more practice working with, looking at some of these problems that you could see on the exam. Okay. So let's go here. So the very first one, I guess I can keep going back. Here we go. So for this first one, suppose the demand for baseball has been increasing over the last 5 years. So if we were then to compare 2019 to 2015 salaries, which of the following would we expect? So unpredictable change, like we don't know, high or lower, or no change in the salaries. Right? So without any other additional information, right, we've got this we know that demand for baseball is increasing. So this one's pretty straightforward in terms of this question, but really anything that could impact demand. So what if we said like overall average incomes are increasing? That would drive up the demand curve, right? What if the number of people interested in sporting events is that's going to drive up, right? And more consumers going to drive up the demand curve. So really what's happening is in all the markets, right? Even if this is just like a ticket market, let's say we could do a ticket market, we've got capacity, right, and there's some demand curve, right, for tickets. Well, if there's an increase in that demand curve, right, if we think about marginal revenue, right, what that's going to do is that for any given win, right, if we then kind of could also, so this is the ticket market, we're getting some additional revenue because demand increases would drive prices up. Even if we're hitting capacity, the price increases would drive up revenues. So if we then think about the win market, right, with a constant marginal cost, we've got overall demand for our team. Well, even if we act as a monopoly, that increase in the ticket market drives up demand and marginal revenue in our win market. So now wherever the optimal number of wins are, we have a higher number of optimal wins. Okay, so higher number of marginal revenue per win, which we're talking about salaries. So what we're really concerned with eventually is the labor market. Right? We've got supply of labor, demand for labor. But remember, the demand for labor is the marginal wins coming from that labor times the marginal revenue per win that it generates. Right? So marginal revenue per win, we just said, well, that gets driven up from these ticket revenue increases, and not just ticket revenue. We could have drawn a bunch of different markets, ticket revenue, apparel, like whatever. Whenever we see an increase in demand for that sport, we would see an increase across several revenue generating markets. So if this is getting driven up, now my demand curve for labor is higher. And if I look at kind of average wages or salaries, I should see that wages increase as well. I could call this, I guess, W and W tick for the new one. Okay? So from anything that impacts the original market, like any revenue market, right? I did ticket market for the example, but it could be anything that might drive up broadcast revenue or any of those markets, anything that would shift demand. Now here I quite simply said right? If we go back, demand is increasing, right? I could have actually made this one harder and said something like, suppose, I don't know, average income for baseball fans has been increasing, right? And then okay, higher income drives up demand curves, higher demand curve in any revenue generating market drives up the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve in the win market for that team, because now every win can generate even more additional revenue, and with that marginal revenue per win being higher, that impacts my demand curve for labor because it's one of the components. Okay. Now I could have asked you, how would I change this from multiple choice to short answer? Well, I could have said depict how basically everything that I just drew, right? Using a graph, explain what, maybe explain why the demand, or explain what shifts might occur and why in the labor market, and identify using a graph where old and new wages might be, or something like that, right? So I could easily kind of convert that same principle into a short answer question. So the next one we have is, suppose that the NBA is a labor market in which the league exerts monopsony power. Right? So compared to a perfectly competitive league, the NBA will have which of the following? So here the key is that we're just thinking about really what are the impacts in a labor market when we have monopsony power. Okay. So I'm going to erase the board here before we go back to it. There we go. So if we've got monopsony power relative to when we didn't, right? So let me see if I can get this to focus a little bit better and not have a glare. Oh, that's not straight at all. All right, let's try this again. Tell you what, it's a lot easier drawing on a board straight on. Okay, so I've got my quantity of labor, I've got my wages, right? So I'm thinking about monopsony power. So initially we start out, we've got supply for labor, demand for labor. Here are where wages start, and here would be kind of the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium wage, right? So monopsony power means that there's only one demand, like per a consumer. There's only one person demanding your labor, right? And so it's kind of the opposite of monopoly. Monopoly is one producer or one kind of like one supplier. So here we've got one consumer, one person who's demanding labor. So when they make their decisions, right, they're going to be making it based off of this marginal expenditure curve, right? Kind of like when the suppliers or the producers, they made their decision, a monopoly would make their decision based off a marginal revenue curve. When you have a monopsony or one consumer, they're making their decision based off, right? Those are the people demanding labor. They're making the decisions based off the marginal expenditure curve, right? So what's true about that marginal expenditure curve is it's twice as steep, right? Same thing as when we were looking at demand and marginal revenue being twice as steep. Marginal expenditure is going to be supply, but twice as steep. So what's going to happen is they make their decisions based off where this marginal expenditure is equal to the demand curve or their marginal benefit. So this is how they choose the equilibrium quantity of labor. So we'll call this QL2. But their wages, right, if they're the only one who's demanding labor, they know that workers are willing to supply labor at that quantity for this amount, right? And so they know that, well, look, why would I offer any wage up here? Because if I offer a higher wage, there's no one else out there to compete with me. So if I offer this, it's not like they're going to decline it because they can't go out somewhere else and get a higher wage. Like, even though the player is actually worth a whole lot more, right, and should be paid a higher amount, if there's only one person that can purchase their labor, they'll take whatever wage they can get that is kind of above, right, whatever their marginal cost is of supplying that labor at that quantity. So here will be my kind of monopsony wage. So instead of 2, let's actually call this QLM and WM for the monopsony kind of quantity and wage. So wages will be lower, and you'll see a lower supply when you have monopsony power. Okay. So that's that. Let's go over here. So, right, lower wages, right, we would see from having monopsony power. So 3 is going to be very similar, and there are some homework problems like this on homework number 4, homework number 3, where you're thinking about you've got monopoly and monopsony power. And so here, suppose the players union and the NFL are arguing over wages. What is the range of possible wages they will agree to if demand is this and supply this? Well, first of all, I probably should elaborate on this. Given some of the things we've talked about, we could probably assume this, but these are just practice problems. If I was to write this on an exam, I would have been a little more specific and said, assume, right, that the league has monopsony power. The NFL, they're the only professional football league. And also, remember the union is able to act as a monopolist because they're the only supplier of labor to the NFL. Right? So given that, we've got these two equations, 60 minus 2q and 15 plus 2q. So we'll go here. So how are we going to solve this one? So I've got quantity of labor here, wages here, and move a little bit. There we go. So I've got my supply curve for labor, which I believe starts at 15. And I've got my demand curve for labor, which starts at 60. Right? Yeah. So when it's basically like the previous one we had. First, let's solve it for when we've got monopsony power. Well, that marginal expenditure curve is twice as steep as supply. So when supply was what, 15 plus 2q, marginal expenditure would be 15 plus 4q. So what we want to solve for is what quantity does that marginal expenditure hit demand? Well, demand was 60, what do I have, minus 2q. So I'll set these two equations equal to each other. Right? So I'll do it down here so I leave myself a little bit more room. So 60 minus 2q is equal to 15 plus 4q. Right? So I do a little bit of algebra, subtract 15 from both sides, add 2q to both sides. I get, what, 45 is equal to 6q. I then kind of divide both sides by 6. I get, what, 7 point, and I would then get quantity is equal to 7.5. Right? So I've got the quantity. Well, now I need to get the wage. We set by going down to that supply curve, what would the last wage they'd be willing to work for? So I'll take that quantity and plug it into my supply curve. So my supply curve was 15 plus 2q. So when I plug that 7.5 in, I get a 30. Right? So that I've solved for the wage the monopsony would take. I then need to find, okay, what is the wage that the monopoly, right, we kind of want. Well, they're going to make their decision based off of a marginal revenue curve, which is twice as steep as demand. So marginal revenue, if it's twice as steep as demand, would be minus 4q. So instead of minus 2q, minus 4q. Then we go through the same thing, except we don't set marginal expenditure equal to demand, we set marginal revenue equal to supply, right? And we'll solve for what that quantity would be. So we go through 15 plus 2q is supply. Where does that hit my marginal revenue of 60 minus 4q? If I do a little bit of algebra here, I'm not going to it's hard to probably see it, but we subtract 15, cancels, add 4q to both sides. I get 6q is equal to 45 again, so q is equal to 7.5. I'm at 7.5, but now I want to find the wage that's up here on the demand curve because I know that the teams are willing to pay up to that amount, right? If I'm the monopoly as the union, that's kind of like an industrial union, right? Then I know that they'd be willing to pay me up to that wage. Well, how do I find that? I just plug quantity into demand. So here's my demand equation. So 60 minus 2 times 7.5, which should be 45. So I know that the range of possible wages, let's get this to focus a little bit better. There we go. The range of possible wages that the union and the league have to come to an agreement between is 45 and 30, right? So the players would be willing to take anything above 30, and the union would be willing to take anything, the union or the players would be willing to take any wage above 30, and the NFL or the league would be willing to pay anything of 45 or below. Right? So in the one problem in the homework, we find this range, and then those become your cutoff points for a threat, like your cutoff. Your threat points or your cutoff points when you're looking at these bargaining examples, right? But you find them like this, and just because in this example the quantity ended up being the same, it may not always be the same for the monopoly and monopsonist, right? It depends on what the equations are. I made the equation a little bit easier so that it worked out to be the same quantity here, just so it's a little bit easier to think about. Okay. So we'll go back. So that's how that was a pretty elaborate one to solve for those points, but it ends up being C there after all is said and done. Number 4, if the players' union and the league, right, are bargaining for the number of preseason games. So maybe on an exam, I would actually kind of, to make 3 and 4 into short answers, I would have them kind of be related. So instead of switching to like the number of games, I would have it, they're bargaining for rookie minimums or I don't know what it is. Maybe player caps or something like that. But it all works the same. So let's say we have this example where the players' union and the league are bargaining for the number of preseason games. The league will take anything over 2. The league wants more, but they want at the minimum 2, and they'd be willing to accept any higher number. The union doesn't want its players playing a bunch of these preseason games that could potentially hurt the players and cost them money. So they really don't want to take anything that's above 4, right? So they won't accept any number above 4, but they would take 4 or below. So if the league is overly optimistic and believes the union will accept any number of games below 6, so 5 or fewer, which of the following could be true? So we'll just look at this first visually, and then we'll kind of come back to the potential answers. So on all these multiple choice, as you're working on the exam, I would draw them out before you even look at the potential answers sometimes, just to make sure you understand kind of what's going on. So here we've got the union will accept any number of games 4 or below. So here's the union. Here's kind of the league or NFL. And the league would take 2 or anything higher. Right? The problem is if the league, so for the league, they might propose 3 to the union, and the union says, okay, yeah, we're okay with that. Right? Or they might propose 4, and the league says, union says, well, we'd be okay with that, but maybe we offer 3 or a little bit lower. We kind of go back and forth. But at least would both be okay with any number of 2, 3, or 4. The problem is if the league thinks, well, look, I want to try to I don't want to propose 2 games because I think the union is reasonable and I think they'd be willing to take a few more games than 2. So I'm going to propose 3 or 4. Right? The problem is if I'm overly optimistic and I believe that they'd be willing to take anything 5 or below, well, maybe instead of, even before, maybe I was I'm it's a little risky, but I'll offer 4. See if the union will accept it. Sure enough, they would have. But now if I play it the same way and I play it risky, I offer them 5 and they come back and say, there's no way, right? And in fact, you could imagine a different scenario. Let's say that the union actually doesn't want to take anything, will only take 3 or fewer, and the league believes they'll take 5. Well, now when the league proposes this, the union says, well, we're not even close, right? We're several games away. This could potentially cause a strike by the union because the league's going to make this offer, and they're like, there's no way. We're way far away. So even with 4, they could potentially do that, right? They're not going to accept 4 if the league offered 5. And so the union might even here say, well, look, we're still at least a game off. We're going to cause a lockout. If this is what you want, we're not willing to kind of give in. Right? So if that's the scenario that we have, we look at this. What's the potential answer? Right? Well, the league will impose a lockout. No, that's not true. I mean, the league was overly optimistic, and that caused the union to potentially strike. So the league will propose a number of games that is too low. That's not true. The league will potentially propose a number of games that's too high. Yes, and potentially cause a strike. Could be something we add on to that answer. And then the union will potentially propose. No, the union doesn't have incorrect beliefs here. It was the league that had incorrect beliefs about the union. So we have C there. So moving on to the next problem, why might the WNBA paying lower wages be an example of gender discrimination? Okay. So which of these could be an example? Lower wages, despite the fact that they had higher attendance. We know that's not necessarily the case, but if it was, would it be an example of gender discrimination if that was the case? Not necessarily, right? Just because they had higher attendance, we would have to look at ticket prices. We would have to look at ads, broadcast deals that the leagues were making. So attendance alone is not indicative that you have a higher demand curve, right? Or higher marginal revenue. Lower wages despite higher supply of females and males in the NBA. We'll actually think about what would the impact be if everything else was the same, but we've got a higher supply of females. Well, so let's say we got the depth. So let's just say we just generally think this could be any labor market, right? If I have a higher supply, that's actually kind of this increase in supply is like a shift out and to the right. That would actually drive wages lower. So that wouldn't be discrimination. It would be the supply that was causing the difference. Lower wages despite, what are the other questions we got here? Or answers. Lower wages despite greater marginal revenue per win, right? So, or lower wages despite lower marginal productivity of labor. Well, lower marginal productivity of labor or lower number of marginal wins that the labor's adding, well, that would actually decrease the demand curve and push down wages, so that doesn't make sense. It's the marginal revenue per win that's being higher, right? Is going to be our answer because, and I probably there should throw on a caveat, kind of, we're assuming everything else is the same, right? So if it's just higher marginal revenue per win, but we're looking at the same quality players, well, all that's going to do is, and we have the same supply of players, what that would do if it was, let's say here was the NBA, if there was higher marginal revenue per win in the WNBA, then yeah, wages should be higher, and if they weren't, it would have to be a result of kind of here was the demand for the WNBA with that discrimination cost in there, right? That decreased that demand curve because of that discrimination. So there, the only answer that we're left with would have to be C there, right? So that wasn't too bad. It's pretty easy. Number 6, right? So we've got some more discrimination stuff coming. Suppose we have 6. Suppose we have 30 NHL teams. Half are discriminating against Canadian-born players and half that aren't. Suppose a player whose value of their marginal productivity labor, remember the demand curve is the value of the marginal productivity labor, so the demand curve is, and the actual value is he's worth $10 million to every single team. So no matter what team we're looking at, this player has the same value. So it's not, we've talked before that maybe there's some team-specific capital that they could do, like if they run a certain offensive scheme or have a certain number of, or a certain, I don't know, if he's surrounded on one team by better players, then the number of additional wins that he could add, there might be complementarities, and so maybe on some teams the demand curve is actually higher for that player. Well, here we've assumed that away. He's worth the exact same amount to every player, to every team. So suppose the player who is Canadian-born, which of the following would expect the player to see? Well, we've got half of the teams are discriminating, half of them aren't, right? So where do we think he would kind of end up and how much money would he get? Well, if we think about this, let's go to the graph, right? So if we've got discrimination occurring from these teams, so this is team discrimination or employer discrimination. No, I was jumping ahead. So we got the supply curve for labor. Let's assume this is constant across all teams. Here's the demand. Here's what it should be without discrimination. Okay. Here's the demand curve with discrimination. Okay. So here's the discriminatory wage. Here's what the equilibrium wage should be. Okay. So if there's 15 teams discriminating, 15 that aren't, let's assume for a second he's like re-signing a deal. We'll set this up so it's easier to talk about. The team that he's currently on is discriminating, so maybe he was drafted by them, he didn't have a choice. But he's going to renegotiate his deal and they said, we'll pay you this wage. Okay? And he says, well, if I take that wage, right, I'd be way below the value that I'm adding to that team. But every other team out there says, yeah, at this quantity of labor, we'd pay you this high of a wage, right? And so basically, or up to the equilibrium point, like, why would I not try to find another team who, look, any other team, they'd be willing to pay me up to this amount. Maybe they offer me a wage right here for that quantity of labor. Right? Well, I mean, that's better than what I'm currently getting, so I would choose to go on that discriminating team. But the problem is, if they offer me a slightly higher wage, so let's say they offer me a slightly higher wage, I provide a slightly higher amount of labor, I'm going to take this wage, right? Because it's a higher wage than I was getting on the team that discriminated. But the problem is there's 15 teams out there. So there's other teams out there saying, well, look, we could still pay him a wage that's below his value to us, so we'll offer this high a wage. Well, then there's another team out there that says, well, look, we could offer this wage and he'd still be worth more. And basically this competition would drive that wage up to that kind of equilibrium point. Right? So if we think about his actual value of the team would be, oops, sorry, I'll go back to this screen, 10 million. Well, yeah, teams will continually pay him up to that value, right? As long as we have more than one non-discriminating team. So he'll end up on one of those non-discriminating teams, and he'll be getting exactly 10 million. Right? Now, if there's only one non-discriminating team, then there's no one to compete with, right? Then when we look at this, we say, okay, whatever that kind of slightly incrementally higher wage was than he was making on a discriminating team, I could offer him just a little bit higher. Theoretically, if we don't factor in things that there would be like additional costs to that player moving teams, I could offer him just a slightly higher wage, right, than the discriminating team. But wouldn't have to be that much higher. But that's only if there's one non-discriminating team. Here we've got half the league, 15. Okay. All right. So short answer, we'll kind of go through a couple of these, and then we'll save the rest for tomorrow. Right? So number one, explain why we would expect graduation rates to be higher in D1 NCAA men's soccer compared to graduation rates in NCAA men's football. Remember, the academic standards are the same for both sports, so we have the same standards. Additionally, why might the graduation rates for the two men's sports be similar if we look at Division III? Right? So why would we think we might see higher graduation rates for men's soccer relative to NCAA or to men's football Division I? Well, we got a couple here, right? We have the same standards, but in one of these, there's probably a much higher amount of money that can be made if they leave early to go to the professional level, right? Also, I don't believe, as far as I know, I probably could look this up, but this could be a reason you're thinking of. This isn't the main one I was thinking of writing this question, but there's no ruling that you have to wait a certain number of years to play professional soccer, then you're not going to have players who go to college and then leave, right? So that could be one of, maybe you're thinking about that way. But it could also be that in men's soccer, right, the revenue made in college soccer is not near the revenue in college football. So we talked about why would maybe we see differences across sport. Well, I might be a little more lenient in my academic standards if I think that student can generate high amounts of revenue for my school. And so I might accept slightly lower academic standards from men's football because those players can generate much higher amounts of revenue for my institution, whereas in men's soccer, they're not generating really additional revenue. In fact, I'm guessing at some schools you could probably argue some of them, they might be kind of have a net negative result, have a loss. And so I might kind of hold my standards to be kind of what it would be for the rest of the school for that men's soccer team. Right? Now, why would it maybe be the same at D3? Like, why would I not expect to see differences across those two sports? Once again, wasn't what I was thinking about in mind, but right, there's not as many people getting drafted from a D3, and so even if they play, they might stay longer. But the real one is, if we think about the revenue generation at the D3 level, well, at that point, football and men's soccer are the same, and so I'm going to have the same standards because I'm not getting the additional revenue, right? I'm not there's no trade-off there. I'm not getting additional revenue by being a little more lax on my academic standards at a D3 school. Okay. So really thinking about what's driving differences there is really the revenue generation makes it so that you might be willing to take a slightly lower academic standard from your football team. relative to like a soccer team. But at the D3 level, revenues are the same across both sports. How might the NCAA tournament not requiring teams to share the money they receive for making and winning in the tournament? How would that impact competitive balance? On the following levels. So cross league, within conference for the Power 5, and within conference for the outside of the Power 5. So the only change we're having here is that the tournament is not requiring teams to share money they receive for making and winning the tournament. So they currently do, so they're making the switch. What's this going to do? Well, before, if you had to share it with the rest of your conference, that meant that the better teams in the conference would have to, let's say they receive $10 million. They share it with the rest of their conference. There's 10 people. Now they only get $1 million, right? Everyone gets the same amount, equal amount of it. Now we're going to where they don't have to share it, and so that team gets 10, the other teams get 0, right? So what this is going to do is it's going to cause the higher quality teams to get to keep more money. Lower quality teams get less money. It's going to drive the distance, between them. So within each conference, right? Doesn't matter if it's a Power 5 or not, we're going to see within conference competitive balance get worse. Now, across the league, there's probably multiple answers to this that would be accepted. If you're thinking about across the league, the one argument could be made that, well, same as within conference, the best teams are keeping the money, the worst teams aren't getting a share anymore, and so it's driving competitive balance to be even worse. Right? But you could also argue that for those lower quality conferences, the high quality teams in those conferences, now instead of sharing the money with everybody else, they get to keep all of it. And so maybe the top teams in each one of those non-Power 5 are more competitive against the Power 5 conferences now, right? And in fact, some of the lower quality Power 5 conference teams, they get no money, so they're getting a little worse. So now when you look at low quality teams in the Power 5 and high quality teams outside the Power 5, maybe those games are more competitive between them. So there's an argument that there could be some improvement in competitive balance, although it more likely than not, kind of there's two competing effects. The effect that kind of wins out is the fact that all the top quality teams are keeping a lot of the money. None of the lower quality teams are getting any of the money. So I like to ask questions like this in the exam. Sometimes I'll combine two. So I would say something like, what are the impacts of not requiring teams to share the money? And, not giving automatic bids, right? And I might do it for the NCAA tournament. I might do things like that for college bowl games. So I'll give you two things that are changing, and sometimes they'll change things in the opposite direction. So for instance, if I say they're not requiring teams to share the money, and then I say the second effect would be that they are increasing the number of automatic bids from each conference, right? Well, if I do both of those things, right, not requiring them to share the money causes competitive balance to get worse, right, across the conferences more than likely. But when I allow for there to be 2 automatic bids from each conference, that gets more of those teams into that conference tournament. Higher number of teams from those lower quality conferences now are getting money, and so maybe that helps improve competitive balance across the league. So I'll sometimes do multiple changes, and then you have to explain, maybe it's indeterminate, but you can't just say it is indeterminate. You have to explain what 2 effects are kind of competing against each other. So, and I think I have an example of one of those later on that we'll cover tomorrow. If not, I'll bring an additional example. We can work on that tomorrow as well. All right, so number 3, assume that both male and female soccer had identical revenues and both are interested in a player with identical marginal wins per labor or quality. Right? If the high quality female soccer player's salary was lower, what is one possible explanation other than gender discrimination that could explain this? Okay? So what would be one possible explanation other than discrimination, right, gender discrimination, that could explain differences in salary despite identical marginal revenue per win and despite identical marginal wins per labor, right? Well, let's think about, what are the things that could shift in a labor market, right? Well, I just explained the two things that make up labor demand, right? So the demand curve for labor is the marginal wins per labor and the marginal revenue per win. But we're saying assume that that's constant, right? If for some reason, and look, I'm not trying to explain away gender discrimination here. I could very easily have made this go in the opposite direction. I just kind of want us to be able to think about this different component. So we've got the demand curve for labor. There's no differences across the male and female soccer players. The only thing that could drive that, let's say we've got a supply curve for men. Here's the wage for men. The only thing that, other than demand, that could drive wage differences here would be the supply curve, right? So if somehow the supply curve for labor, to provide the same amount of labor hours, they would only be willing to do so at a higher wage, right? Or this decrease in their supply curve. Or maybe I just have fewer women soccer players. If I'm thinking about not just on a per player basis, I could even think about this as the pool of players and kind of average kind of wages for those lower quality, right? Notice with a lower supply, I get that kind of women would have higher wages. I think I might have done this in reverse of the problem. Okay, so I just had the exact reverse. So if the supply curve was lower, then we would expect to see higher wages for women. Or if the supply curve for women was higher, right, an increase in their supply curve, then we could see lower wages for women, and that wouldn't necessarily be a result of gender discrimination. Okay? So here is kind of how we can think about shifts in demand and supply. We didn't really focus a lot on the supply, but any differences that we see in the demand curve for labor or supply curve for labor could push differences in wages for genders or race. But then we also have those additional components we've been talking about that, well, what would it look like if there was also discrimination as well? Okay? So this is just a good example of showing how supply curve differences could push wages to be different between genders. Or like I said, you could do the same thing for race, domestic versus foreign. Oops, I dropped the whiteboard. But yeah, you could, whatever kind of two groups you're looking at and thinking about, is there discrimination going on? You have to first look at and see, are the supply curve and demand curves the same? And if they weren't, how would those differences kind of predict differences in the wages? I'll go through one more here. So suppose there exists owner discrimination against black Major League Baseball players. However, consumers and advertising agencies are not, right? So you've got owner discrimination, but consumers, advertising agencies are not. Explain using graphs of the labor market why top quality black players still could see close to equilibrium wages, and low quality black players would see lower wages than non-black players of similar quality. All right, so let's go to the whiteboard here. It's kind of a complicated problem, but it kind of allows us to highlight some interesting stuff with discrimination. Okay, so let's first think about high quality black and non-black players, right? So we've got quantity for labor, wages. Right? Let's assume, probably should throw in this assumption in the problem, let's assume the supply for labor doesn't differ between the two groups. So if I have a high quality player, doesn't matter if they're race, the demand curve should be here, okay? With discrimination, right, for that high quality player, we give this additional cost, so plus discrimination, but discrimination is like a cost, so it's negative, so it pushes that demand curve down. So they'd be willing to pay lower wages, right? But the question is, so suppose that, why could these top quality black players still see close to equilibrium wages, right? Well, if there's additional, right, revenue to be made with advertising agencies, or if the TV markets and things don't care about the race of the black player, they just want the highest quality. Well, then this high quality player, right, even though I have discrimination, maybe it's that relative to a low quality player, even with the discrimination, they still get a higher wage than this low quality player, right? So it could be that if we don't break this up and we're just looking at kind of like average wages, the wages we see going to this high quality black player who's being discriminated against would still be higher than the kind of average player, or if we kind of look at low quality players, it'd still be higher than a lot of these low quality players, regardless if they're black or white, because part of that demand curve for the high quality player is driven up by the additional revenue they could bring into the team. So even if we have kind of this, this decrease because of discrimination, if the agencies don't care, there'd be this is kind of pushing that demand curve up higher. But for low quality, right, there's no additional revenue being made, so the discrimination there, right, the demand curve for low quality kind of black players, so plus discrimination, would really drive wages of those low quality black players down a lot. Right? So we're thinking about differences in high and low quality, right? There's no additional revenue from the low quality players, so that group's going to be hurt a little bit more by the discrimination than the high quality, because the high quality, even though there's discrimination, they can kind of make up part of the gap by all this additional revenue being made from people who aren't discriminatory, right? Maybe ad agencies or payrolls, whoever's making deals for the official logos of the team and things like that. But let's say even ticket revenue. So we can think about differences in quality and how discrimination will play a slightly different role. Right? How can I add something to that one? Because I was trying to think. You could also start to think about, maybe I have differences. What if, like, if I'm only let's say here, we'll change this. So what if I'm only focused on high quality players? Let's say that I do have, on average, right, differences in the skill level, right? So let's say, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the case for my example, but we could look at any two groups. So let's do here. I'll do a good one. Let's do domestic foreign, right? Let's say, because I don't like doing race things, because I'm not, it's good to understand that, but it applies to anything, right? So let's do domestic foreign. Let's think about the NBA maybe. So let's say that, or you could even think about NHL, right? Canadian born, non-Canadian born, right? So we've got this demand curve, and let's say that on average, let's do the NHL one, Canadian born players, domestic players, if we think about, I know there's other teams of the NHL outside of Canada, but we'll think about them. The Canadians maybe are somehow better, right? They grow up playing it more than people in the US do. And so when we compare, even holding constant quality, right? So when we look at these demand curves, I'll do this for US and for Canada, right? So we've got the marginal wins per labor of the US, marginal wins per labor from Canada. Even if we're looking at them being on the same team, if they're on the same team, this marginal revenue per win is the same. The only difference is if the marginal wins in Canada is a little bit higher, it pushes that demand curve up. But now let's say for some reason, right, we're looking at this market, and the market, maybe it's mainly driven by U.S. consumers for NHL hockey. Maybe they're discriminatory, and they actually like seeing more U.S. players. Well, it could be then that the demand curve for labor for Canadians plus this discrimination would get pushed down. But notice, wages could still be higher for those Canadian players, even with the discrimination, than it would be for the U.S. players. Right? You could also think about if there were differences in the marginal revenue per win. That's really what is kind of consumer discrimination is being driven by. But let's say it's not just discrimination, but for some reason, Canadian players can generate more money. How can we think about this? Let's say that because the Canadian players are higher marginal wins per labor, it drove that demand curve up, so they were able to make additional revenue for the team because of that higher quality. So that did push it up, but then the discrimination pushed down. So they still could have wages that are higher. The discrimination, if we think about if they were to have the same quality as U.S., discrimination would for sure push the wages down. But because of the higher quality, it kind of negates some of that impact. So we can kind of think about that combination as well. Discrimination plus quality differences between the groups. Right? Okay. All right. So I think that's probably a good one to end on today. We'll do the next 4 questions. This one's got a few parts to it. And I'll bring in some additional problems to kind of work on tomorrow as well. If you have any questions on your projects, a couple of you have reached out. I've met with a couple of you. You're getting those to me. I'll try to kind of review some of those who have sent them to me early. But kind of early this week, I'll be a little bit busier kind of taping lectures for this class and my other sections. But I will try to look at those as soon as possible. Most likely Wednesday, I'll be able to knock out quite a few of those. Okay? All right. We'll end the video recording there.